everyone. Welcome to Unchained, your no-hype resource for all things crypto. I'm your host, Laura Shin. If you enjoy Unchained or Unconfirmed, my other podcast, which now features a weekly news recap after every interview, please give us a top rating or review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. This helps other listeners find out about my podcasts.
Kraken is the best exchange in the world for buying and selling digital assets. It has the tightest security, deep liquidity, and a great fee structure with no minimum or hidden fees. Whether you're looking for a simple fiat on-ramp or futures trading, Kraken is the place for you. CipherTrace cutting-edge cryptocurrency intelligence powers anti-money laundering, blockchain analytics, and threat intel. Leading exchanges, virtual currency businesses, banks, and regulators themselves use CipherTrace to comply with regulation and to monitor compliance.
Crypto.com. Get their app and buy crypto at true cost with no fees or markups. Get a metal MCO Visa card with up to 5% back on all your spending. Want more? Download the Crypto.com app today. The topic today is China's digital currency, DCEP. Here to discuss are Martin Chorzempa, Research Fellow at the Peterson Institute, and Devi Yuan, Founding Partner at Primitive Ventures. Welcome, Martin and Devi.
Hey, Laura.
Thank you.
Before we dive into the topic at hand, why don't you each give a little background on yourselves and how you came to understand the financial technology sector in China? Martin, do you want to start?
Sure. I arrived in China, moved to Beijing in mid-2013, just at the moment when Ant Financial, Alipay launched Yuobao. So I lived in China during the beginnings of its financial technology revolution and also the beginnings of its interest in Bitcoin. And then decided to go start a book project writing about fintech in China that I'm almost done with.
And Devi, what about you?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in China, and so I did my undergrad just back in Guangzhou, and so I'm a Cantonese, and so that is where the province and state is the headquarters for Tencent, NetEase, and Xiaomi, and then all this many of other just Chinese tech giants. I moved to US at the age of 20 to get my master's degree in Carnegie Mellon University and moved to Bay Area. So right now, I'm in Bay Area for about almost 10 years, and I spent my first 4 years in eBay as engineer and product manager. That's when I learned about Silk Road as one of the marketplace out there, and so that was back in 2012. And I learned about Silk Road and then further get into Bitcoin. And that's how I got into crypto and, fintech, marketplace, in general. So after eBay, I work as venture capitalist and for the rest of my life and pretty much cover anything fintech, crypto, and marketplaces. So have been doing this crypto related investment for last 4 or 5 years and heavily involving all this community governance and crypto asset investments and trading, mining, etc.
Great. Yeah. And you also often break news in the crypto space on your Twitter feed, which I find really funny because sometimes I see some journalists complaining hey, we were working on a story on that. And Devi just told everybody on Twitter. Anyway, okay. So why don't we get into all the events that happened around blockchain in China recently? Now, from my perspective, I would say kind of the frenzy around all this began when Xi Jinping gave a speech on October 24th saying that China should seize blockchain. So why don't you guys just describe for me kind of what he said, what you thought the significance was, and then maybe go into what you thought were the other big kind of pro-blockchain events and initiatives that happened in China afterward. And you can also give your reaction to each of these.
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, this is actually not the first time that Xi Jinping, publicly promote blockchain. And so I think that's probably not to the knowledge of many Westerners out there. And so I think that's in 2017 or 2018. So he actually promoted blockchain, but during a smaller scale, just doing a smaller scale public science conference. So I think like this time is like definitely like more significant because it's like a dedicated like long speech. So in a very core CCP meetings, right? And then just right after meeting, so like there's all this like public news out there and just like official CCP media outlet talk about it. And then so have all these coverages. So the narrative, so if we look into his speech, like the narrative, so like a few things I want to highlight here is, so first of all, so he mentioned that like blockchain is the future and like China cannot lose the blockchain game and China needs to have the leadership position on it. And then also like during his speech, and he specifically mentioned, other major nation states out there across the world are accelerating blockchain technology development, and we have to do so as well. And then so he also said we need to focus on helping to establish the blockchain standard. Because I personally, as a investor in all these public blockchain projects, and I have no idea what the standard is because everything, is a permissionless. And then so everything form a consensus like based on the community discussion. But like Xi Jinping did mention that to further enhance like China's leadership position, and we want to making the standard global, and then so we want to establish like the blockchain standard like whatsoever. So I think these are the few things I want to highlight. So from his speech, so like the overall narrative is like definitely extremely pro blockchain, but he didn't mention a single word of like Bitcoin or like any other like the actual cryptocurrency out there. So if we read between the lines and then also thinking about like what has happened before, like China's government is pretty good at this top-down planning and like infrastructure investment, like as we can see all the miracle of this metropolitan development and like high-speed railway, etc. So like as the economy grows, slows down, and China's government needs to further figure out like what's the next like infrastructure level thing for them to make investment on and potentially to get China onto like a leadership position before like any other countries. So I think like technology like AI and like 5G. So like those are the topics for like last few years. And like this time, so like with like Xi Jinping's promotion on blockchain. So blockchain as a neutral database management technology is definitely being elevated like onto the priority list. So as the next generation infrastructure technology that like the entire China will allocate resources. So that is my personal take.
Martin, what do you think?
Yeah, there's a lot there. So going back to before Xi Jinping's talk, I view one of the most important events of China's support or at least interest in blockchain as in 2014, when the central bank convened a group to study digital currency and blockchain to see if there's a way to use it both for regulation and for government purposes. And then soon after that, the State Council, which is sort of the equivalent of China's cabinet, included blockchain in a government plan for technology development. So I view the Xi remarks as a culmination of a longer process that slowly feeds up the bureaucracy. I think the timing is really interesting, and that especially because there's been a sense that much of the hype around blockchain around the world got a little bit ahead of itself. So, ICO prices have gone down quite significantly. Bitcoin is down quite a lot from its height. And though there have been an enormous amount of enterprise and other applications that have been announced, there really isn't any that appear to be a breakout success in terms of application for blockchain other than Bitcoin and Ethereum. And even there, there are a lot of issues with how many transactions they can handle, for example. So that makes me wonder, why would this come out now? And I think the result, it's a result of two things. One is the trade war. So if you look at how the trade war has extended into technology, the Chinese have found that the United States controls a lot of very foundational technologies for AI, for example. Many of the chips are U.S. technology. And I think that China fears that if foreign countries, especially the US, are the ones designing the standards or controlling the basic technology for blockchain, even though the applications are further in the future, they view that as a potential threat to national security. And that's why I think we see the phrasing of as a core indigenous innovation technology. That's the phrase that Xi Jinping used near the top. And then the second is as a response to Libra, which is also somewhat related, where China doesn't want an American company like Facebook to be able to create a global blockchain networks that other people then build on, which might get in the way of China's attempts to internationalize the renminbi and have its tech companies go abroad, for example, in fintech markets all around the world. So they want to be leading the standards and potentially helping even other countries develop their own blockchain-based digital currencies and other systems, so they don't have to depend on something like Facebook and can hopefully get something out before Facebook succeeds, and that might actually work.
Yeah, so I want to add on to that. So from my personal opinion, and I don't think Libra is like significant enough like to actually require like just C's level attention. And it's like an hour long talk like during the CCP's core meeting. And also like Facebook has been spending like 3-4 years, and just like Zuckerberg has been trying to be friendly with all these like Chinese government and like officers, and like basically trying to make Facebook accessible in China market, and like which like didn't pull off. And I think it's just a coincidence, like probably so like the timing itself like seems like a response like to the Libra, because it's just like second day like after the Zuckerberg, so it's just second day after the Zuckerberg hearing, right? But from my personal opinion, like the digital renminbi has been developed for like 5 years and it's actually close to launch. And then CCP happened to have that meeting as well. And then so it has been scheduled long before. And like, so everything is kind of like a very perfect timing in response to Libra. But I think like China, like previously never responds to any just like company from private sector for like any specific policy out there. So that's just my personal opinion.
Martin, what do you think? Because I saw you tweeted something else. I mean, I think in a way, maybe both of you are right. I think this was something that was in the works for a long time, but I'm pretty sure I did while I was doing the research for this show, and I'll just have to look for it afterward. I do think that there was some statement saying that Libra spurred them to kind of like hurry it up a little bit. Like they, had been working on this for a while, but then when they realized that Libra, came out with its white paper and that this might launch next year, then it just made them hurry up a little bit more. And I think maybe actually where I disagree with you, Dovey, is that the reason why I think they might pay attention to this, even though they might not pay attention to other, moves by companies, is that Facebook's user base is bigger than the Chinese population, and it's literally. I was trying to figure this out. I think it might be one of the only entities on Earth where they can say that. So, but anyway, actually, I wanted to go back to a previous point you both made, which both of you basically said that you felt that China essentially wanted other countries or technology groups, whether it's like, companies or organizations, or perhaps even some of these decentralized networks, to follow their blockchain standards. Do you really think that that's like a realistic expectation on their part, that people might do that? And why do you think that is their motivation? So
it's potentially realistic, because you can imagine a world in which if China launches a digital currency that works well and is successful, and if they have, for example, like Tencent's system working with tax authorities to deal with better tracking of invoices, if you have these domestic systems that actually work really well, then there's a sense in which China's trading partners especially, but also maybe some of the financing destinations along the Belt and Road and others who do investments in China might want to make sure their systems are interoperable with the Chinese systems, which are, say, proven to work. And I can see that happening, at least in some limited scenarios. There are some real questions around to what extent they will actually be willing to decentralize and allow some of the anonymity or at least pseudonymity that has been the feature of blockchain-based systems in other applications. But that's really an open question. I'm a bit skeptical about how their ability to either promote renminbi internationalization or get others to sign up on its standards. But I know that in other areas, like, for example, in 5G, Chinese companies have been extremely active in promoting standards. And I think that Huawei, for example, is part of many international 5G standards, notwithstanding the security concerns that many governments, especially the U.S., have voiced about it.
Yeah, actually, let's keep talking about this standards issue, because this actually leads to like some other questions that I had, like about the significance of the cryptography law. I was kind of curious, like, what that said and, like, why they have this cryptography law, but I'm assuming that has to do with standards. And then I happened to notice also this news about how they have these 500 different enterprise blockchain projects going. And CoinDesk reported that the biggest categories of the projects are trade finance, asset management, cross-border payments, and supply chain financing. And I kind of thought, they have like this major role in global trade. So is this like, part of their attempt to get companies and organizations outside of their own borders to either use their technology or to actually use their blockchains that they're creating?
Just add on to what like Martin has said, when we think about blockchain standard, and I think there are like a few different, there are like a few different layers, and like the most fundamental layers are gonna be, what's the specific difference in like hashing algorithm, right? And when you build a specific blockchain protocol, and so that is the consensus layer. So that is the consensus, consensus algorithm layer. So I have no idea how Chinese government can actually push that as like a one singular standard, and because there's existing other either public or like semi-public or just like private blockchains out there and using different consensus algorithms, and it seems to me that's impossible. And if we move to the upper layer, and like the upper layer gonna be just like at the application layer, right? So at the application layer, I'm not too sure about what is the specific standard. Is it on like identity? Is it on like account, whatever? So is it on like, so it might be on account-based identity, and then many other just like cross blockchain, just like characteristics out there. And so it seems to me also it's hard to push out a specific standard out there. But like one thing I think they might be able to like leverage is if like consider we have like a China chain, right? So it's like a China whatever blockchain. And so all the other major scale internet company like Tencent, Alibaba, Huawei, so they all adhere to that specific blockchain like protocol. And so so like they have been developing application on top of that. And then like also like it would allow like third party so to develop their own applications, and which means all the other blockchain developers can instantly tap into like this massive user base. And I think that can be a huge traction. So like there can be a huge traction to other third party like blockchain developers. And so either Chinese developer or just foreign developers, because the current problem of like all this like public blockchain is that there's just like no adoption. Like the primary use case right now is trading, and like all the exchanges, like they're like just, so they're daily active users is on the low end of say like 100,000. So that's like definitely not internet scale. And if you have this shared platform, and so that will allow you to tap into the internet scale traffic. And so like that will be a huge like add-on. And so if they want to push for specific like standards and like protocols out there.
So I guess like the one thing that I'm wondering is with the current internet in China is this, like closed wall, what do they call it? A closed wall garden. So why would the Chinese want, I guess my thinking is basically that if they make things interoperable, they also risk then kind of like losing a little bit of control.
No. So
right?
Like the underlying infrastructure is not going to be interoperable. Just I think about WeChat, right? WeChat is a closed source operating system. And then so you as a third party developer and you can develop all this like WeChat enable program. So like what's considered as like a micro program. And so WeChat has its own ecosystem, like just like Apple, and WeChat has its own like app store, right? But the thing is like WeChat as a messenger app or like as a operating system, like cannot be interoperated with like Facebook messengers, like say for instance, because like you as a developer, you have to adopt the same protocols like underlying, just like right now. So all these are Ethereum like DeFi application. So can only work on Ethereum, right? And so like there's no Bitcoin DeFi yet, right? And so that is actually the same thing because the underlying chain and just like the underlying blockchain infrastructure, like the tech layer, like has to be cohesive. And like there's no like just like cross-chain thing among the other public blockchain. And so the third-party developer is basically purely adopt the same consensus algorithm and like the same and like just like the same blockchain infrastructure and then building application on top of it. And so that's a very like a typical thing even right now. So even right now in the public blockchain domain.
Okay, so yeah, this leads me to a question about censorship, but I actually feel like because we haven't actually discussed the digital yuan yet, why don't we just dive into some of the details on that because that is obviously the biggest news. So why don't you guys describe for me your understanding of, what this aims to be, this DCEP, which stands for Digital Currency Electronic Payment. What does it aim to be? How will it be structured? When and how do you think it'll roll out? Why do you think China wants to launch it? Just kind of give me everything that you understand so far about it.
So a lot of the elements of it are pretty unclear at the moment. Because we have to rely on a few speeches, many of them in private, who've had their transcripts leaked to know what's going on. So far, the plan seems to be, at least at the beginning, to replace cash, to at least a piece of cash, and create a system that allows a cash-like digital currency to be transacted. So that means you'll have a digital wallet. The idea is to maintain what they call the two-tiered system now, which is that the central bank manages the currency, but in terms of what actually touches consumers, they're going to be interacting with and buying these at the commercial banks in the country. Maybe also Alipay and Tencent. That part is unclear, but at least it's going to be like the banks. You come in with 1 renminbi and you can buy a unit of this special digital renminbi, and you're probably going to use some sort of digital wallet. What's really important about this is that it appears that the central bank will not actually be providing direct central bank access like accounts to consumers. That's one of the biggest question marks in central bank digital currencies going forward, because that would totally change the way the financial system functions if you can go right to central bank, because most of the money is actually created at the moment in our financial systems at the commercial banks. So they're saying, well, we're not going to touch any of that. We're just going to replace cash. We don't want to compete with Alipay balances, Yuan. We don't want to compete with bank deposits, which would disrupt the financial system. Only cash, which is already a liability of the central bank. So like cash, they've talked about having it quite limited and difficult to use in a sense. So you have a limit in the amount of money you can have in the wallet and a limited amount of transactions you can make to kind of make sure that it mimics the fact that cash, especially in China, the largest bill is 100 renminbi, which is worth something like between $15 and $20, much smaller than most countries. They made it on purpose difficult to use cash so that it's harder to use it for corruption. Officials get arrested in China for corruption, and sometimes we find entire apartments full of bills. And the amount of money actually isn't even that much in the grand scheme of things because the individual bills are worth so little. One of the key features of it is what they call controllable anonymity. So you can use cash at the moment without any trace whatsoever, pretty much. There's no, if you pay at a restaurant in cash, then they have no idea who you are. You've told them nothing about you, and there's no record of that transaction generated digitally anywhere. But now the way that Chinese interact and have financial transactions is generally through Alipay and WeChat Pay, which are tracking all of those transactions and also feeding that into questions about how they evaluate you for credit and what they want to market to you and all of this. So the central bank is coming to people and saying, we're going to provide a more anonymous version of currency than what people are transacting with Alipay and WeChat Pay. But of course, we still want to get some underlying visibility into the system so that people can't use it to launder money and get up to nefarious uses. That's another critical question about this. How much access is the central bank going to get? There are a lot of concerns that this could be used to actually increase the amount of control that the central bank and the government have over the economy by being able to view these transactions individually. Whether it will use something like smart contracts I don't think it will start that way, but they have talked about potentially adding it. You could potentially automate payment of taxes. You could change transaction fees for different types of transactions to encourage or discourage them. You could have new kinds of monetary policy tools. A lot of possibilities are open. So I'll turn it over to Dovey to see what she thinks of this.
So from my perspective, and I think there's a very important prerequisite for this digital renminbi, is that the Chinese society has been cashless for long enough, and which no other countries in the world is so advanced on getting rid of physical cash. So there will be little problem in, user education, digital currency distribution, and payment interface integration, etc. So from my understanding, the most intense or just detailed literature about the design of this digital renminbi was first published in about 2016. So that's in a internal journal from PBOC. They have a few chapters about what they think about this digital renminbi. Fast forward to now, and I think there are probably over 100 patents, over 100 patents under PBOC, specifically about digital renminbi. And talking about the timeline, so I think there are rumors floating around saying, so it might be launched by November. So it might be launched by by probably mid this month. But I think that's probably just too rush. So realistically speaking, and I think the earliest it can launch any just a very smaller scale experiment, going to be by the end of this year. And so I'm not too optimistic about it. And most likely, so the trial gonna launch early next year. And from what I heard, it can be in Shenzhen or Hangzhou. The full rollout, and I think at least it will take another 12 months. And because there's a lot of coordination and just the infrastructure change is massive. And talking about the bigger picture, just like Martin has said, the biggest question right now is whether PBOC wants to use this new medium, this new medium of cash because it is not physical cash. So like unlike physical cash, like it can be fully anonymous. And so like people have like just like when people transact with a physical cash, and it can have like pretty much actual privacy. But if we look at the current major problem of the China's financial situation is the shadow banking is actually what makes the economic, just like the overall economic, like on the verge of like explosion. And China right now has more than 10 trillion like shadow banking asset. And then all of this is actually all of this is outside of the visibility of PBOC. If we look at the empty monetary supply of China, close to 30% of monetary supply is actually under the sector of like shadow banking. Shadow banking basically are peer-to-peer lending and then all this like wealth management products, like things like that. These are all outside the regular commercial bank's balance sheet. So I think from my perspective, one of the most important purpose for this digital renminbi, at least like domestically, is right now, like commercial bank has much more power, like when it comes to monetary supply and then also like monetary policy and then also issuance. And I think this can be a major monetary experiment as like it will be the first time. So it will be the first time to make central bank, like PBOC in this case, with like direct influence on the monetary supply and daily economic activities. And I think also it will make it possible to have I think it will make it possible to make the monetary policy, to probably enable PBOC, like they will be able to program like the monetary policy. Like say for instance, if the Chinese government like wants to cool down like the real estate market, they can simply do so by subtracting the monetary flow into that specific sector. Like if we consider everything will be back to M0. So if we consider a large portion of the monetary supply going to be full reserve based, I think that might be the bigger picture that like PBOC like has been thinking.
Okay, we need to dive a little bit more into that, but we're going to have to do that after this short break so we can hear from the sponsors who make this show possible. Crypto.com sees the future of cryptocurrency in every wallet. Have you seen the MCO Visa card? A metal card powered by crypto, loaded with perks including up to 5% back on all your spending and unlimited airport lounge access. They pay for your Spotify and Netflix too. What's not to love? With Crypto.com, not only can you spend your crypto, but you can grow it too. Earn up to 6% per year on the most popular coins like BTC, XRP, LTC, and up to 12% per year on stablecoins like PAX or TUSD. Just a few taps before you start receiving interest every week. Join the over 1 million others and download the Crypto.com app today.
Will the world follow France and advocate banning privacy coins? Will government-backed stablecoins become the new fiat? Are distributed and peer-to-peer exchanges just a flash in the pan? The answer is maybe. Virtual currencies can flourish and create a new, private, and more versatile economy. But that grand vision can't happen without keeping crypto clean. And that requires support of governments and accountability for bad actors. Privacy-enhanced compliance using cryptographic controls has the potential to preserve anonymity without compromising legitimate investigations. CipherTrace is working on this vision of the future. Sign up to stay up to date on the Privacy-Enhanced Compliance Initiative and receive authoritative crypto AML reports quarterly. www.ciphertrace.com/keepcryptoclean. Today's episode is brought to you by Kraken. Kraken is the best exchange in the world for buying and selling digital assets. With all the recent exchange hacks and other troubles, you want to trade on an exchange you can trust. Kraken's focus on security is utterly amazing. Their liquidity is deep, and their fee structure is great, with no minimum or hidden fees. They even reward you for trading so you can make more trades for less. If you're a beginner, you will find an easy on-ramp from 5 fiat currencies. And if you're an advanced trader, you'll love their 5x margin and futures trading. To learn more, please go to kraken.com. That's KRAKEN.com.
Back to my conversation with Martin Chorzempa and Yuan. So, Devi, when you said that if the real estate market was getting a little bit too hot and the central bank wanted to cool it down a little bit, they could just stop the flow of money into I don't even understand how that is possible.
So right now it is not possible, because most of the inventory, most inventory of the monetary supply, so it's actually in the control of the commercial banks, and so PBOC has no direct control, right?
Right. But I'm saying, with this central bank digital currency, how would they do that?
Yeah, so assuming everything is assuming the entire GDP and the entire monetary supply is on this digital renminbi, right? So that can be a very extreme case, but let's assume that, and all the commercial bank, and they will have their account. So they will have their just a node or whatever. So they will have their account with the PBOC, because all the commercial bank will be the distributor of this. So of this digital renminbi. So they have to basically ask for the approval of issuance, and then ask the approval of any circulation of this digital renminbi, right? And then the entire ledger gonna be on the private cloud, of PBOC. And so that's why PBOC will have the overall visibility on what's going on. Say for instance, so if this much of the renminbi is actually issued by China Merchant Bank, say for instance, and to a specific endpoint. So if that endpoint gonna be as a real estate company or a local, or a local major China real estate, or a real estate developer, so they can actually make specific endpoints so that is not visible, or that is not accessible to getting into this monetary flow. And so if everything is on the same ledger, so that will be possible, because right now there's a disconnection. So there's a disconnection when all the commercial bank talking with their own clients. So the disconnection here is the PBOC cannot get involved or just interfere whenever commercial bank is, so whenever all the local commercial banks are interacting with their own clients, and then with any potential monetary output. So that can be a very extreme case, but I think if partial of the monetary supply and M0 gonna be on this blockchain rail, so there's a lot of things that can be creative.
Yeah. I mean, and obviously we're getting a little bit into speculative territory here, because it's not like the whole entire money supply will be in this digital currency. But I do take your point that the central bank definitely will have more control over the money supply and possibly over credit creation. So when I was reading a little bit about that, it did make me wonder if that could, if the rollout of this DCEP could affect kind of the growth of the economy, which frankly probably has been fueled by a lot of this M2 activity. Do you guys have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I want to add a little bit to this context that Devi was mentioning, which is that there's generally a perception that Chinese companies are tools of the state. If you talk to people in Washington, D.C., for example, and assume that the Chinese government can get access to whatever data it wants on anyone at any time. And my research into the financial sector shows just how wrong that is in many cases. The people at the central bank have been frustrated for years about their inability to get Alipay and Tencent Pay to share data with them on the transactions that are occurring. And if you look back at the aftermath of the financial crisis in China, they tried to clamp down on the banks lending, but there was so much pressure from other actors like local governments to keep the credit taps flowing that the banks just moved everything off their balance sheet and started using all this shadow lending, and the authorities just kind of let it happen. So there's an enormous amount of activity that occurs in China, which the government can't really see. And despite all the surveillance cameras and other things that have grabbed a lot of headlines, in many cases, Chinese private companies are able to stand up to the government, and they have their own powerful political backing and play sometimes. The bigger they are, the more they have to play in these factional political battles that might, make a Chinese entrepreneur sometimes much more powerful than a Chinese government official, depending on how highly ranked they are. And one of the things that could change with that is, as the Chinese government has made it clear that they want more control and more ability to access data. And there's a big question as all these new infrastructures are built, will the company's ability to resist data requests continue to exist in China? And I think that's a big question. That's really important.
Yeah, that's a really nuanced picture that I feel like we don't normally get. I feel like you're right that the conception is that the big Chinese companies are kind of just like an extension of the Chinese government. But I actually want to go back now that we've kind of discussed the structure of the DCEP to talk a little bit more about some of the themes that were coming up earlier in the conversation, like about whether or not China could use this digital RMB to internationalize the currency and help it gain adoption abroad. There's a lot of talk when you read some of the materials online about how they have this Belt and Road initiative and how that will connect 65 countries in Asia, Africa, and Europe. And I just wondered, is that one way where they could kind of leverage, this network that they're creating and push the digital currency? And, if not, or whether or not you think so, I'm just curious, how likely is it, do you think, that either companies or people in other countries will want to use a Chinese currency?
So there's a trend just all over the world. And so there's a trend of just de-dollarization. And so if we look at the global reserve of US dollar asset, it has been shrinking over past few years. And RMB is actually picking up as one of the alternative reserve, in some of these central bankers out there in the world. And so I think most of the other nation states has to make their own decision. But the ultimate goal is always to diversify their own reserve portfolio. So they have to ask themselves the question, would they prefer their current dependency on US Federal Reserve, or they might be adding on to more dependency on just on the PBOC, right? So I think it will be a very open question to many central bankers out there, but just fly with the trend of reducing US dollar asset, so in foreign exchange reserve, and then also given China has bigger and bigger cloud along this Belt and Road initiative. So because right now, so if you go to some of these local Africa countries and you can see massive infrastructure investment coming from these state-owned enterprises. And there's already just good enough and huge amount of trade between Chinese company and local governments and just and then also local private sectors. And so I think the digital renminbi itself can actually facilitate that trade, become more smooth. And because it will actually make the interbank settlement so potentially easier. And then also if we think even further, so PBOC might be able to export this digital fiat infrastructure and then helping the other underdeveloped country, and then basically to help them to leapfrog the credit base or the traditional based banking system out there. And then so the entire Africa country, so say for instance, it can be Uganda or whatever. So they can actually a leapfrog and then to have the same level of advancement as what the China society has. I think if I'm CCP, and that's definitely plays in my favor.
So I have a much more skeptical view. I think that might be possible in the very long term. But although, I haven't seen the data on dollar reserves going down, but I did see that actual international use of the renminbi has actually declined. And if we look back to a few years ago when there was this exchange rate reform in China, which also was corresponding at the same time with much tighter capital controls that made the renminbi harder to use. Since then, renminbi internationalization has pretty much not advanced at all. So I think about payment systems usually in the context of network effects. You need, and also the ecosystem. You need to be able to plug into lots of other countries, and the ecosystem here is like financial infrastructure. Are there ways for people who are trading different currency pairs, especially your currency, to be able to borrow in it, to be able to freely use it, to be able to hedge risk by, with financial instruments? Are the markets liquid to buy and sell? And so far, even though the renminbi, is part of this existing financial infrastructure with a network that all of the central banks are and financial players around the world are plugged into, people are not demanding to use the renminbi more. And I think that's an important sign, because if you have a digital currency that runs on some unique architecture and requires a duplication or a completely separate set of infrastructure to be built around it to be able to use it, they're going to have this DCEP, but nobody else is going to have anything analogous to it for a long time. And that means I just don't see how that makes it easier to internationalize than using the existing infrastructure, especially when much of this is unproven. And we consider that one of the main reasons it hasn't internationalized is because China's government hasn't been willing to release some of the capital controls and free usability of the renminbi. So unless this digital renminbi has different characteristics and is not as tightly controlled, I don't see how other countries would want to use it. They don't want their countries to renminbiize any more than they want it to dollarize. I can imagine that they might work together to develop a digital currency from their own home currency, but many of these countries, even if they're getting large investment from China, still want to protect their sovereignty and be very careful about maintaining their own domestic currency. So I kind of feel like the renminbi internationalization piece, there's a lot of demand for a separate architecture than what exists, which gives the United States enormous leverage. There's talk about alternatives to SWIFT, which is the messaging system that's used for most global cross-border payments. But I'm not convinced that digital currency is at least in the short and medium term, the way that this is going to get fixed.
Yeah, so I just pulled the data out, and so I looked at the global dollar share of the reserves and versus the renminbi share of the reserve, and actually starting from 17, starting from 2017. So the dollar share of reserve actually declined from about 66% right now to 61%. And the renminbi share of the reserve actually increased from 1.1% to close to 2%. Even though it's a single digit percentage, but if we think from just growth perspective, so that's almost 100% growth. So I think all the central banker around the world, and so whatever, so they want to do, to diversify their reserve portfolio, and other than dollar, Japanese yen, and then so all these usual suspects, and renminbi is definitely probably the most promising candidates. So they can potentially have on their reserve portfolio. And then also add on to this payment has network effect. And so I totally agree on that. I think from just strategic planning, Alipay and WeChat Pay can potentially as the Trojan horse. So for this digital fiat currency or digital renminbi, and then to be widely used in the just outside China. And so it's all about usability. And then so it's all about how many offline merchants so can actually accept this payment. And I think if like PBOC can actually facilitate that from happening, just I have, so potentially have a better policy when it comes to foreign exchange settlement, things like that. So that can actually drive the adoption really fast. That's my 2 cents.
All right. So we have so many topics. So I'm going to have to move you guys along a little bit more quickly. In the backdrop of all this discussion, especially around what currencies it is that some of the other countries, like smaller countries especially, will want to hold as their reserve currencies, is the Libra question. But before we get to the Libra question, I actually want to ask about one other aspect of the digital currency, the digital yuan, that Martin brought up earlier, which was this controlled anonymity aspect. Because I wonder if this also will play into whether or not other countries will want to use the digital yuan. And, here, and granted, I have no idea. Literally the only stuff I know about China is like what I read in the Western media. And apparently, there were these stories around the social credit system that then later other reports said, like Chinese people were saying, like, this is overblown. However, one report that I saw did say that by the end of 2018, people who had poor social credit were barred from purchasing plane and train tickets 23 million times, which, okay, granted, it's a huge country, but still, that sounds quite alarming to like, I think anybody who grew up in a place like the US, that just feels kind of crazy. So I just wonder, like, first of all, how do you think this controlled anonymity will work? How much surveillance do you think it actually, has? And how do you think that will affect, other countries wanting to use the currency?
Something quick on that social credit. So what you're talking about is a blacklist. Like if you borrow a lot of money and then default on your loan and refuse to pay it back, and the court and a Chinese court judges that you could pay it back, but you're maliciously not paying it back, or you're refusing to comply with the court judgment, then they put you on this travel blacklist. It doesn't happen from not visiting your parents enough, or like not writing enough positive things about the party online, or any of that stuff. So, there's an element in which there's a score that Alibaba creates with Sesame Credit. That's a totally separate thing that got mixed up. There isn't like some number that if it falls below, you're barred from it. So I wanted to just make that clear. But in the controlled anonymity part, that's an area where there's probably a lot of debate and disagreement, even within the central bank, about what ultimately this will look like, because they really have to do a balancing act here. If there's too much government surveillance of it, I don't think people will use it, both internationally and even in China. If the Chinese people know that someone at the party is going to be able to watch every transaction they make, they're not going to use it unless you force them to. I would think. But my sense is what they'll do is allow you to transact anonymously with very small amounts. And then as amounts get higher that you're transacting and the risks of money laundering get higher, then they will impose more identity verification. And that's a similar system that they've used for digital payments, where they require more pieces of identity, for example. And much of it is about just being able to transact without giving any information about yourself to a merchant that you're paying, and also without giving it to the big tech giants. So you might want to buy your booze, your baijiu, and cigarettes with a DCEP instead of Alipay, because you might have your Sesame score get lowered a little bit and have it a little bit harder to get a loan from Alibaba. But so far it's really hard to know where they're going to come down on the amount of privacy they will allow.
Okay, so let's actually just turn to Libra, since, as I mentioned this, I feel like this has been part of the conversation, even though we haven't really been discussing it. So do you agree with Facebook's pitch to the U.S. government that Libra is its best strategy for countering kind of like the threat from China? And also, do you think that Facebook is being genuine about saying that, since, as Debbie mentioned, not too long ago, Mark was like trying to court the Chinese Communist Party, and Debbie even had this tweet where he had a book by Xi Jinping on his desk.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So I think like the Libra thing, if we look at just like back in the history on like why Facebook wants to have this project initially, and I think Facebook is being very opportunistic, and like Zuckerberg being, Zuckerberg being as a businessman, and so I have like no problem of him just like being shaky on a lot of things and just like talking about one story in front of the CCP, and then like the other story. So the opposite story just when it comes to like the U.S. Congress, right? And I have like no problem with that. But I think Libra itself, like the Libra itself is like after 5 years of like David Marcus with Facebook and as the head of the Messenger, like it has been trying really hard just so basically to like push out something similar as a WeChat Pay. But like, so I think they didn't just do a good job, right? So like the in-app payment transaction just like didn't just like, just so they are not able to like pull it off. And so like the whole Libra project, I think started about 1.5 years ago, and it's kind of in a rush. And I think like Facebook actually used this like to FOMO simply to FOMO the US government, and like because we are in like this geopolitical tension and trade war with like China, and like this can be like Cold War like 2.0. And so to be honest, like the best way, just like to think from US perspective, in order to make like the digital version US dollar leading the game. And I think the easiest way is just to like have the Fed so I think like the easiest way is that the Fed should just allow all this private sector, no matter it's Libra, no matter it's Coinbase, no matter it's Tether, and then as long as like there's enough like stable coin, one-on-one backed by like US dollar. And then like those stable US dollar coin can be the interface. And then so they can compete with each other. And then so to better user adoption, better user experience. But as long as like the backend is all pegging to US dollar. So that is how the US dollar can actually have the have the leading position of this digitization of the money game. Like it does not have to be Libra. Like even though I agree, Libra has a very massive like user access. And so I think like the other thing is Libra wants to bypass the current US commercial banking system. So like that's why at the very beginning, like the 27 Genesis node or like just like the Genesis partners, and none of them are actually commercial bank. And I think the US government should also support major commercial banks like JP Morgan and like the other like actual commercial banks out there, and then allow them to have their own just like digital US dollar coin. So their own version, because at the back end is actually still dollar. And so in that way, they can actually further enhance like the dollar position, like in the whole digital world. And they don't have to align or just like being extremely supportive on like any of this party from the private sectors.
Martin, what do you think?
So I would say there's a grain of truth in what Zuckerberg has said, because if you look at WeChat's attempts to expand abroad, they've pretty much all failed, mainly because Facebook and WhatsApp already dominated communications and chat in all those countries. And that was the basis for WeChat's, that was a spearhead for their ability to create a super app in China and compete with Alipay. They use this advantage in chat. And Facebook's user base is enormous. It's all around the world. So you can imagine that this would be a great way to head off Chinese fintech companies and Chinese financial institutions' ability to expand their success in China abroad. And that's what some of the Chinese have explicitly said, that a PBOC official noted that ultimately it could be that if Libra succeeds, it's just going to be the dollar that ends up winning. But I don't necessarily see that geopolitical potential advantage to the U.S. as a reason to just allow Libra to go forward, because there are so many unanswered questions about how this will work. And it's really unclear whether the existing regulatory system around the world could handle the potential challenge that could result if the over 2 billion Facebook users suddenly immediately find it easy to use Libra in their existing apps if it just gets pushed out to them. You could imagine that say in countries like middle income countries or places like Venezuela or Turkey, where there's a lot of inflation, that people might dump all of their domestic currency for Libra, and that could be extremely destabilizing for those currencies. I don't expect that it would have much impact on the advanced economies, but China is really afraid that of a scenario where it's easy for China to ban Libra and have it not be a threat to China specifically. But if it catches on and becomes a unit of account and important for the digital economy all around the world, except in China, they don't want to find themselves in a scenario where they're isolated or find themselves having to let Facebook in to avoid being isolated.
Yeah. One thing, and this actually goes back to earlier when I was saying that I thought that I had read that one of the officials involved in Libra, the DCEP did cite Libra as like a motivation. And yeah, I see here, Mu Cheng-chun, who is the head of the PBOC's Digital Currency Research Institute, said, quote, if Libra is accepted by everyone and becomes a widely used payment tool, then after some time, it is entirely possible that it will develop into a global super sovereign currency. We need to plan ahead to protect our monetary sovereignty. So I do think, for this reason, actually, that the possibility that Libra might instead be released as different stablecoins pegged to a bunch of different fiat currencies, that could, kind of mitigate that fear that the Chinese have, and frankly, increase the potential that the digital yuan does end up having more power globally than U.S. lawmakers might like. So we're running out of time, but I actually really just want to ask a question about Bitcoin. Alex Gladstein of the Human Rights Foundation came on my other podcast, Unconfirmed, and he said that he thought that all of this will end up being a blunder for Xi Jinping, because he basically said that to learn about blockchain, you end up learning about Bitcoin, and the Chinese will be more attracted to Bitcoin than they will to the digital yuan. And, I kind of brought up, in the past, people had said that they thought that the internet would open up China, and obviously that hasn't really happened. And you read these articles where Chinese people are just like, I'm happy with the internet I have. They're like, who cares about Google and Facebook and, whatever. So, do you think, but Alex was saying that money is a different thing. So do you agree with Alex that this could end up being kind of like a gateway to Bitcoin? And if so, do you think that will have some kind of effect on the power that the Chinese Communist Party has on China?
So I think this blockchain blessing from Xi definitely help just this generic, just a Bitcoin awareness, because blockchain and Bitcoin, these are two concepts, they're interrelated, and it's very hard to isolate one from each other. And we can see from all this recent educational material, released by CCP, and so they actually have to refer. So they actually have to refer to the history of blockchain and then actually mention Bitcoin, because traditionally, in past few years, the narrative around Bitcoin among just average Chinese is Bitcoin is a scam and crypto is a scam, and I think at least this kind of a narrative can be eliminated. But we have to keep in mind that the average Chinese citizen, and then also by Chinese culture, is very prone to authoritarian statement. So I think if the message from the Chinese Communist Party is, okay, blockchain is good, digital renminbi is good, I think most of the average citizen will just prompt into this Chinese version digital currency, but probably not Bitcoin. And it might be in the very long term when the Chinese economy probably melt down, and then people are not happy with their current living just a situation, things like that. I think whenever there's a potential sovereign fiat crisis, I think that can be just a cognitive, like, awaken moment, like, for the local Chinese. And so they might be considered, okay, so probably Bitcoin is actually the plan B. Like, the other thing to keep in mind is Bitcoin is already very expensive, like, in the eyes of like any newcomer of this side. So just like any Chinese citizen who's new to digital currency or like cryptocurrency, like the average annual household income back in China is about $10,000 every year. So whoever is new to Bitcoin in China, and I think 99.9% of the chance that like he or she will not think. So like he or she will basically think Bitcoin is already too expensive and then it is too volatile. And so why I should buy into Bitcoin and then just instead of probably buy into stock and just probably stick with my current just a daily renminbi activity, right? And so I think there's a huge gap and just there's a huge leeway before the Chinese citizen eventually consider Bitcoin as like a store of value.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's also the fact that China's government has cracked down so much on cryptocurrency exchanges, made it difficult to buy Bitcoin in China. You can still do it through some peer-to-peer methods, but it's not terribly easy, and many of the ways to buy it might appear quite shady for an average Chinese person. But I think it could actually, this push to blockchain might actually backfire in another way, which is that this is a very new technology that is mostly unproven for most of the applications. And if there's too much investment in it and too much of an idea that, the top leader has said we need to apply it, so we're going to apply it whether it makes sense or not, it could actually lower Chinese growth and make things less efficient by trying to jam blockchain into areas where it doesn't make sense, especially if they're not willing to decentralize and use it as the technology was originally intended. So it's very hard now to be in China and be a blockchain skeptic, which I think is an important viewpoint that needs to be there in these discussions. But no one, that kind of article would now get censored because you're disagreeing with the top leader, and I think that's a big problem.
I would definitely agree with that. Oh my gosh, that's a hugely important point. Anyway, okay, so we've covered so much, but just one last quick question. I wanted to hear from each of you on what your prediction was on how this global digital currency space race will play out.
So I think my prediction is giving all this resource allocation, and I think China will be the first one to launch a nationwide scale just digital fiat currency. Like the US, on the other hand, because they don't have like strong enough like incentive, like given like the current US dollar's leading position in in our global economy. I think US gonna be behind, and so there will be probably second tier nation states, say for instance potentially Canada or like potentially Singapore. I think they will also catch up to the game as well. That is my prediction.
Do you think Libra will be a player or no?
I think like Libra, they have to be US dollar peg. And so if like they can be 100% US dollar peg, but like not a basket of like the other currencies, and I think they have a chance to so basically to like get the approval from like US from the US government. I think that's like a big if.
Okay. And Martin?
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think that generally the way that blockchain is developing in the US, there's so much regulatory uncertainty that I don't think most of the, I think it's going to be held back there compared to places like Singapore. Libra is a big question mark. I would actually think that some of the smaller countries and smaller central banks are going to be the first to issue central bank digital currencies before China. Like maybe Sweden will do it before China. And actually, countries like Uruguay have already done pilots where they've put central bank digital currency in the hands of, they've actually done pilots where regular people can use it. So China, if it comes out with a pilot, won't be the first to do so. But it might be I think it'll be the first major economy to end up doing so. But I think Libra has more of a shot in the short and medium term to be successful internationally.
Okay, great. All right. Well, we will check back in on how you guys did. Thank you both so much for coming on Unchained. Oh, no. Sorry. I'm sorry. Actually, before that, where can people learn more about each of you?
So just for all the audience out there, you can follow me on Twitter at W1, or just probably also send email to me at w@primitive.ventures.
And for me, I'm at Chorzempa Martin on Facebook. It's a long name, but it's not too scary. CHORZEMPA Martin. And then my profile with all of my work is on the Peterson Institute website. If you just search for my last name and PIE, that'll come up, and then you can read all of my blogs and policy briefs and other stuff, including writing on central bank digital currency.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you both so much for coming on Unchained.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us today. To learn more about Martin, Duffy, and the China DCEP, check out the show notes inside your podcast player. If you're not yet subscribed to my other show, Unconfirmed, which is shorter, a bit newsier, and now features a short news recap, be sure to check that out. Also, find out what I think are the top crypto stories each week by signing up for my email newsletter at unchainedpodcast.com. Unchained is produced by me, Laura Shin, with help from Fractal Recording, Anthony Yoon, Daniel Nuss, and Josh Durham. Thanks for listening.